Hey everyone, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the Women History Month 2023 Speaker Series. I would like also to recognize our center colleagues, Shaletta Green and Dr. Brahmi. Shaletta will help me with admitting participants and moderating the chat. My name is Suelen Schneider de Maria, and I will be the host for today's session with the Center for Global Partnerships in Learning. If that is the first time you hear about our center, I will share with you some information. The Center for Global Partnerships in Learning provides our GSCP students with a myriad of services ranging from publication support, certificate programs, access to the GSCP academic journal, our scholarship without borders, and also events like this one, info sessions and workshops on various topics. Now, let me introduce to our guest. Tissa Richards is an award author, repeat software founder and CEO, and leadership expert and keynote speaker with a mission to create unshakable leaders, teams, and organizations. She speaks and trains executives at Fortune 500 and hypergrowth organizations, including NASDAQ, the New York Stock Exchange, Chief, and Forbes. She guides them to create blueprints for individuals and organizational success, develop high-performance culture, and diversify C-suites and corporate boardrooms. So please help me to welcome Tissa in her presentation entitled Learning and Practicing Resiliency, the Secret of Unshakable Leaders.
Thank you so much, Suelen. I really appreciate it. So I really want this to be as interactive as possible. So if you have a question as we go, throw it in the chat or just put up your hand. I hear myself talk a lot, so I'm very happy to be interrupted. I have slides. I'll share those in a couple minutes, but first I want to really set the stage for this topic. And what's really exciting actually is I'm doing a TEDx talk on a similar topic in 2 weeks here in Austin. So clearly I'm excited about that, but I'm also really passionate about this topic. And so I think I want to just kind of start by asking you about just a couple of scenarios, just to sort of show how global this is, both in your professional and your personal life. So just think about the last time you were in a situation that you were tempted to react to. So you get a text message from a friend, a partner, a colleague, right? Where your fingers start tapping at, you're reacting viscerally and your fingers start tapping out a response before your brain can even catch up. And I think that's especially true now that we have this immediacy of texting and emailing and this ubiquity of communication, right? Or maybe you're in a job interview or you're just having a conversation and a recruiter or somebody throws out, let's say, a number, a salary number, and you're already nodding and saying, yeah, that sounds great, before your brain starts processing and you can start to say, you're pausing, you're thinking, and you're sort of thoughtfully responding with what maybe your actual salary expectations would be or how you bring value, and you can open the aperture more around that. And there's so many examples, but I think the situations are universal where we tend to react viscerally before we pause and respond thoughtfully. And what's really important is as the stakes get higher, some of those are low stakes situations, some of those are high stakes situations, but it's really critical that we optimize our responses because it's critical to the outcomes, but even more important to me, I think, is that it's critical to optimizing our resilience. And I believe that we can learn to replace that human tendency to react by sort of developing some habits that helps us scale our resilience. And we can develop some habits to do that. And I think there's 3 habits that I want to talk about today. And then I want to show you inside of each of those what some of the frameworks we can use to do that. And those to me are ones that we can use, like I said, at work, at home, But when I say sort of this idea of unshakable leadership, to me, what that means is that you can be resilient, both when there's things that are negative, but also positive. So ways to open experiences, open opportunities for you. And I like to really think of it as like, I'm sorry, it's been a long day. I'm gonna start that again. Replace this tendency towards like fight or flight with what I like to really think about as do what's right. And I like to think of it as like this moral muscle memory, right? This values-based muscle memory, and that will really scale your resilience. And I just want to tell you a quick story about this before I share slides, because I mean, it's easy for me to say, hey, this is what I think you should do, but I do what I do today because of where I came from. And we all have values that we've had for a very long time in our lives. You know, when I was in second grade, I walked into the principal's office and told the principal that I wanted to change teachers because we didn't see eye to eye. And so I've been doing this since I was very young. I don't know if it's being a redhead, but so the values that I really live my life on are fairness and integrity and respect. And but they really saw me through what my professional life has been, which has been starting companies, scaling companies. And in the last company I had, I don't know if any of you have ever started a company, but the Cliff Notes version is really stressful, really risky, sometimes not that fun. And when I was about 7 years into my last company, it was like make it or break it time. I put my whole life savings in. We were sort of at the critical moment of precipice of success. And I had to make a decision. I'd taken no salary, whole life savings. I think you can see the financial stakes are pretty high. And I had to make a decision based on a belief I had that the moral decision, the right values-based decision was we had to shut it down. And the stakes can't be higher at that point, right? Basically losing every dollar I had, plus now going millions of dollars into debt. My health took a huge dive, all the relationships in my life, family, friends. And think about the decision paths. I could have decided, I'm just going to keep doing this because that's the easiest thing. Or I can do this and just basically be in the fetal position under my desk going, oh God, this is awful. Or I can make the values-based decision and deal with what happens. But how do you sort of react to that in a way that still maintains your resiliency and sort of rise like a phoenix out of it and sort of choose again, that values-based path where you're going to choose resiliency and stay true to your values. And I think a lot of those things are reminding yourself there's a difference between failure and defeat. Every decision you make is one grounded in values. And that's partly where I am today, right? Why I choose to do what I do, to help other people make these decisions and to never find yourself in a situation where you're viscerally killing your resilience. So I want to just sort of take you through these 3 habits that I see as being how you sort of learn and practice resilience. And that sort of framework of choosing your values, choosing how you lead. But I'm really known for being very practical and actionable. So these are the 3 habits, and I like frameworks. I think they're really useful. And so I want to go through each of them. So I like to think of them as reflect, repeat, and replace. I want to go through each of them and sort of show you a way to literally dive into them. So if we start with the first one, reflect. Here's what's really interesting. We already each have a set of values. We make 35,000 decisions every day, each of us. We just don't do it consciously because can you imagine how exhausting that would be? I mean, it's literally like, what time do you set your alarm clock for? Why? I mean, do you just wake up right before you have to get out the door to school and work? Or do you get up a little bit earlier to exercise, walk the dog, write in a journal? And then what is that based on, right? Do you smoke? Do you not? Is it because you value your health? Are you vegan? Are you vegetarian? Do you pick up litter when you see it? Do you give money to someone in need when you're out running errands? There's so many, all those little things are automated, but they're based on your values, right? And one of the things we don't necessarily do is reflect on the why. So if I actually ask you to stop and say, what are my values? It's really, really important. And it's to bring it up to that conscious level. And so when I work with leaders, which I do every single day, I ask them two questions. And those two questions are really interesting because we do this, but we do this at a subconscious level. So I like to ask, who are you? And then who are you as a leader? And when I ask that question, who are you? I'm really asking, what is the value that you bring? Why does it matter? How do you, when you work, when you're in your life, and this is now in a professional situation, but how do you transform people? How do you transform outcomes? When you do this, if we basically took you out of a situation, what would happen? This is kind of that question around like, what's your value proposition? Why you? So what? And a lot of people can't answer this question. So this is a really important question to think about for yourself. And I do whole keynotes on this because this is really important. But the really important, what we're focused on today is more on the values side, not on the value side. So we can come back to this anytime, but this is what I really want to answer, which is the who are you as a leader and why? And I really like this framework of the 3 I's, right? So identify, internalize, and inform. So if we really, well, I did spend some time with this. So this leadership style, right? So how do you lead? How does it manifest? So to me, this is really, really important, right? So if you have a team, if you're a teacher, even just in any context, I like you to think, okay, how do I lead people? And the how does it manifest question is really, really important to me because I can't tell you how many people come up to me and say, you know what, I'm really collaborative. I'm really empathetic. That's great. But it's missing the second piece, which is, and this is why it matters. This is what my team or what the people around me can expect. And then the second I is that internalize, because if you don't really literally internalize it for yourself, then it's just a word you're using, right? And then that third I is, it's really communicate, but I think 3 I's frankly sounds a little bit better. And then why do we want to tell the world? So I want to show you some like really tangible examples. And I'll just do this by showing you how we're going to do this. So here's you can do these DISC, you can do Gallup, you can do Strength Finders. Those are all great. But I really like using your own words. I think there's some power in literally pulling these out of yourself, right? So here's some ways you can do that first I. Who inspires you? You've probably worked with or for people who did not inspire you, but people who really did. And how would you describe them? And then that question of how did it manifest? I'm going to show you an example, but how have people have probably described you before, and they've probably described you pretty consistently. And then you can start to group those, right? And then what feels right to you? Sometimes people will describe you and you're like, yeah, I don't know, doesn't really stick. So let me give you an example of mine. So I lead as a founder, as a CEO, with empathy, curiosity, and transparency. So sometimes, remember I told you, some people will come up to me and say, I lead with empathy. Okay, great. If you can't go to that next level, not that useful. So when I'm leading a team in a software company, this is literally how it manifests. They have the freedom, the safety to experiment. To me, that's really linked to transparency. You can't make a software company successful if you're not able to actually experiment and be free to do that. This is that whole idea of psychological safety, right? Respect and empathy is really important to me. Super, super important. So yelling, there is no yelling. Any of my personal life and my work life, you do not get the best from me in that case, right? Transparency, again. So in a startup world, we don't always know where the money's coming from. We don't know when the next funding round will be. Really, really important to me that if my team says to me, how much money do we have? What's our runway? How long will you be able to pay me? That I will say to them, I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you our financials. Or if they say to me, hey, how many customer deals are in the pipeline? I'm going to show you. So I think it's really important that you're literally able to say, not only are these my values, but this is why. This is how when I hire people, I can say to them, this is how we actually act. So it goes from being this sort of like theoretical thing to this very practical. Does that kind of make sense? And when you think about it, this is not that different from my personal life either. So some of the ways that you lead in the office or in your workplace might be different, but I think this is this idea of kind of bringing your whole self to work. But this is also very, let's go to this idea of internalizing. We're going to get to these values in a minute, but it's really important to me that you internalize this, because if somebody were to ask you, hey, tell me how you lead, and you think, collaboration sounds good. So you find these things that you've heard, but you don't really internalize it, it's not going to feel really authentic. So that's a really important piece of this to me, is that you internalize it so you can speak about it in a really authentic way. And informing, this is the communications piece, right? Why would you want to also tell people? Because when you can tell people in a job interview, whether you're the manager or you're the person being hired, people ask about this. And now you're able to say to somebody, hey, if I lead with transparency or I lead with curiosity, here's why. You're literally now creating a culture, a way of being that people can expect. It's very consistent, right? You're able to say to somebody, this is how I lead, this is why, this is what you can expect from me. You're being yourself. You're not trying, it's very exhausting being somebody else, frankly. But if I can't tell you how many times I'll go in and I'll do a workshop or I'll do a consulting project, and about 80% of the leaders will say to me, I don't actually think I know this. So taking the time to do this is really, really interesting. And that leads really perfectly to the next thing. And this is where we get to the resiliency piece, because you can pull these descriptions of how you lead out of a hat, but they're really underpinned by why you lead that way. And so when I ask people, hey, describe your leadership to me, I always go to the next level and say, now why? What are the values that are really, frankly, non-negotiable to you that actually underpin it? And this is an interesting way to get there. So you're kind of like what we were talking about at the beginning. It's this sense of why. And what, to me, this process of figuring out the why is very similar. You're going to notice it's the 3 I's, right? So what is really interesting to me about the values piece is that these are very, very linked to what you'll accept and what you won't. Sort of these like more universal, not universal to everybody, but to you, these fundamental feelings of principles, right? And it's sort of a belief structure. It's your non-negotiables. And these now kind of cascade to these situations that you're going to say, I'm taking something off the table, or I'm going to act in a certain way because of my values. And I want to show you how we get from how you lead to your values. So let me show you. Well, before we do, I forgot there was this slide. So we're going to do this slide first. You can see I don't usually like slides, but okay, what's important to you about your leadership style? What are the things you'd say, okay, I'll give this up, but I absolutely won't give up this. So for example, if I said to you, yeah, I'm collaborative, okay, but I will not give up that transparency. I will not give up that respectful way of leading. And what are the behaviors I will not tolerate? Because they're so antithetical to who I am as a person that I would rather leave this job. I would rather shut this company down. I would rather just walk away than tolerate this or speak up. And what am I willing to risk? And this is where we start to talk about resilience, because if you let this stuff happen, it's going to build up and it's really going to impact your resilience. So let's kind of go to, I lead this way, right? And not that I want to talk about myself all the time, but it's easy because I have these in my head, right? So if I lead with empathy and curiosity and transparency, there's a reason. It's because I respect people. I think everyone deserves compassion. The truth and ethics and honesty are fundamental to me. I simply will not budge on those. And I'm very curious. I want to know why people do what they do, what's possible, probably what drives me to start software companies, even at that huge cost, right? So these are the things, these are what underpins that how I lead. And it's a really curious exercise. I'd be super curious if you go and do this, because you're going to potentially find these things out about yourself. There's a good chance you already have all this information. It's just those 35,000 decisions you make a day, you just haven't surfaced it. This is why that first habit is reflection, right? So remember, you go from here, you have how you lead. What are your non-negotiables? So for me, yelling, disrespect, lying, unethical conduct. So your values are just the opposites of your non-negotiables. Makes sense, right? So if I'm in a situation where these things are happening, those are my non-negotiables. So my values are the opposites of my non-negotiables. And I can tell you, I have stood up and walked out of a room when my non-negotiables are happening. Now, I don't do that in a very fiery way without context. Context is really important. And that's why we have those 3 I's. First, we need to identify it. We need to internalize it. And then we're going to inform people. And we're going to walk through that in a second. But identifying it is so important. If you don't realize this is a non-negotiable and this is why, you won't be able to do the next part. But I'm going to give you this example. I know that when people are yelling and they're disrespect and there's a lot of chaos around me, you're not going to get any value out of me. I'm not resilient. I'm not at my best. So I will say, when people get really escalated, I will say, both in my personal and my professional lives, I am happy to come back. Let's take a break. You don't get the greatest value out of me when we're in this situation. And there's people who are the opposite. I know that. And I respect that. I know there's people who get escalated because that's how they get really, energized. But I will say, and I have said to customers, to investors, to shareholders, whoever, this may be how you work really well, but this is not how you get value out of me. So we can all take as much time as we need. We're going to regroup when we're all calm, because that's how I work the best. I'm not just storming out, but think back to, why do we inform people? It's so that they know you're setting expectations. It's the same thing with that honesty, transparency. If I feel like something unethical is happening, it is absolutely a non-negotiable for me. So think about yours. Other people's are different, and it's totally fine. And so now, why do we want to do that second I, which is internalize? Because this is critical to resilience. If you think it's one of your non-negotiables, if you think it's one of your values, but you haven't fully internalized it, it can be a little bit icky or a little strange to do that, to stand up, to take it off the table. So just like your value proposition is a fact, your values are a fact. It's not an opinion. I don't defend my need for a calm working environment. I just present it as a fact. And I've never had anybody argue with me about it. No, Tessa, you got to stay here. You got to stay in the yelling. No, I don't. So if your leadership values are integrity or collaboration or whatever it is, the really important thing is, once you've internalized it as a fact, now you can communicate it. Now you can contextualize why it's important to you. I don't think I can say this enough times. So important. I get excited, clearly. But it's a foundation of how you can offer the most value in your personal life and your professional life. This is critical. And now we get to the third I, which is inform or communicate. In a difficult situation, you can explain why you're making a decision, why you are taking a certain action. And if you have a team to take care of, you have a family to take care of, you're contextualizing that. And you're basically saying, I am doing this because. Very powerful. I am known for my integrity. I am known for my transparency. Just as powerful as when you say in your value proposition, I am known for my research into X. I am known for my ability to create revenue for this kind of company. They're just as factual. Is there any questions or don't worry, we're getting into questions and discussion after, but feel free to interrupt me. Remember, I don't need to hear myself go on and on. Okay, so now the next habit, which is repeat. So the next habit of really resilient people is practicing. If it becomes muscle memory, the only way to develop muscle memory as an athlete is to keep doing something, right? And it's the same thing with resilience. So many people say to me, don't worry, I got this. When the stakes are really high, I'll work on it then. But it's too late then. There's too many curveballs that life can throw at you. Imagine that you are, I will give you an example. I had a client I was working with who said to me, you know what? I got a message from my company that we were only going to be paying bonuses to the executives and not to anyone else. And that just didn't feel right to me because our teams were really the ones that had worked the hardest. And if we hadn't already done this work, she hadn't already figured out one of her core values was fairness. And what's 90% of people dread hard conversations because they're hard. Nobody loves running headfirst into hard, difficult things, right? But we'd really been working on that together. So what she was able to do was to go say in her context, right? I really value fairness. This does not feel fair. What I would like is for you to take my bonus and distribute it to my team. I will take 0 of it. It was a hard conversation, but she contextualized it. She explained why, and her team really appreciated it. But we'd been doing that second habit, which was repeat. So she was able to really have that hard conversation and it didn't feel as fight or flight, as difficult. So it is really too late to leave practicing for hard things or those curveballs for when they happen. And that's why I really think about how do you handle difficult things? We've got to practice that muscle memory now. And that really leads us to that third habit, which is replace. And in this case, what I mean is what is our instinct? I think of this as like replace fight or flight with do what's right. And fight or flight is not just literally when you're in a physical thing, but that could be shutting down, that could be avoiding, that could be reacting. Remember, I'm going to type out a response. I'm going to type out a reaction quickly before my brain catches up. And so in this case, think about think about what values am I activating, or what values is this situation calling on or compromising? And how am I going to respond instead of reacting? And that's really going to help you scale and optimize your resilience. And so if we just use as an example, hard conversations, what's really interesting is hard conversations are not just unidirectionally hard. Everybody dreads them. So if we just practice them and think, okay, the other person is probably having just as hard of a time, knowing that, thinking the value you might have, compassion, fairness, whatever it is, and you look through the lens of that, suddenly you're thinking, this is hard for both of us. Helps you de-escalate it. There's lots of ways to do that. Instead of putting it off, if you just approach it, for example, and de-escalate and say, look, I know we're probably both dreading this. I know this isn't going to be fun for either of us. Would it be okay with you if we just talked about this? Just so many ways to de-escalate. And you make that a muscle and you literally practice it. Now, when the stakes are high, like with Julie, having to go and say, I don't think it's fair that we're only giving bonuses to executives. How can we do this? I'd like to do this. Now you're literally starting to replace that fight or flight with a really values-based response. Now, when there's a big curveball that's coming your way, your adrenaline, your cortisol, it's all just going to be a little bit calmer because you've practiced it. So the things that you might dread, we can replace that dread with, I got this. So now when somebody says to me, I got this, I believe them because I know we've practiced it. Or, oh, I don't want to speak up. we've practiced speaking up all throughout. So that's all my slides. That's my book. But yeah, just I'd love to just ask you, what situations have you had? Have you thought about your values, your non-negotiables? This is where I just want to stop talking and start asking.
So I have a question just for clarification.
Mhm.
I love everything you're talking about and just kind of want to understand. So you said that leadership values are the opposite of non-negotiables. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Can you clarify that a little bit? I'm trying to squish it into my brain.
Yeah. Yeah, let's go back to that slide too, just to, yeah. Okay, let me share again, just to, if I could find the share button, that would be so much easier. Here we go. So let's say that you're, like in this case, one of my non-negotiables is yelling or disrespect. To me, if that happens, it's not negotiable for me for that to happen. So then my value is respect. So if we think about one of your, and this doesn't have to be final, but think about a non-negotiable for you. What's one of your non-negotiables?
Yes, respect, definitely.
Okay. So, well, I guess in that case, a non-negotiable would be disrespect. So a value for you would be respect.
Oh, okay, I get it.
So, for example, another, and this, so I've had somebody say to me, a non-negotiable is, oh gosh, I'm just blanking. Wait, is, what's the thing where you are not, you can't be counted on? Like you're
unreliable.
Unreliable. So their value is reliability.
Got it. Okay. I see it now. All right. Totally. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because you're really thinking like what's important to you and how does it, you're looking for the opposites.
So, well, okay. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Yeah. Because I think what we're doing there is kind of surfacing like what are the most important things for you? And you don't have to do it that way, but I think it's a way to help get to your values. Like, collaboration. So in some cases, I think somebody once said to me, he was trying to get to one of his values was like collaboration. And he was saying like, I don't like when people go rogue or go lone wolf. It's like, so his value was collaboration. And they're all over the map and that's totally fine. See, it's kind of thought-provoking. I don't expect you to leave in the next 20 minutes going, I got it. But it's just a way to make you think. Crystal, I see your hand is up, which makes me really happy.
Thank you for so much. This is really super encouraging and validating, and whatever other adjective that means great. So thank you for sharing. So my question, just sort of to dovetail off of Dr. Brahman's question, around leadership values, and non-negotiables. So if I value, or a non-negotiable for me is disloyalty.
Mhm.
I can see where it's safe to say that a leadership value is loyalty, but I don't know that that's my leadership value. I think that's just a personal value at my core that really does, it shows up in my leadership, but it's not just leadership. So my question then is, how do you differentiate between who you are at your core as a person versus leadership style, values, things like that? Does that make sense?
It totally does. And, you know, it's interesting is I think probably because when you think about it, I think that your leadership style is probably more leadership-y, not a real word. I just totally pulled that out of my ass. Am I allowed to say ass, Sue Ellen? Okay. Okay. No one gave me a list of approved words. And I think, Crystal, that I think you make an interesting distinction because your leadership values are probably more your durable values. I would probably think it would be interesting if you had like a set of home values and a set of office values, you know?
Exactly.
And so no one's asked me that, but for me, those values are just how I live my life in general. And so I would think it's really interesting because loyalty to me would be probably what you expect from all the people. And it would make sense that it's also going to extend into your professional world and your personal world. And I think, so Sue Ellen, to what you just asked, can you separate them? Maybe you have a few that are in the business world, but I would think about some of those: accountability, trust, ethics, whatever they are. Again, I think you should be bringing your true self to work, because I wouldn't want to see your professional persona and then you take it off and you hang it up when you get home, because authenticity is really important. And so would you be uncomfortable walking into a business situation and saying, I'm not comfortable with this because loyalty is how I conduct myself in all areas of my life? You know, as opposed to saying loyalty is how I conduct myself only in the business world.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that personally, I think who you are personally spills over. Well, you know, now that I say that out loud, I think you're right. I think it's bi-directional.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you.
Think about too, like that would really eat into your resilience, wouldn't it? If you're trying to maintain these different personas. So you're right. I actually think maybe I should just call these your leadership style and then just your core values. You've made me really think of something I've never thought of before.
Yeah, I think that's what was tripping me up. It's because I absolutely think of it as my core values. And so they show up in my leadership journey because that's who I am at my core.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't separate them as just leadership values.
Absolutely. It's what you would expect from your significant other, from your family, from everybody.
100%.
Yeah, I really like that.
20% of that when you write your next book.
You got it. Yeah, I love this. Patty, you've had your hand up, but I was so blown away. I just had to think about this for a minute.
Absolutely. And I love your question, Crystal. That was really, really helpful and good clarification. I was just thinking about how challenging this is, because when you started talking about this in my own leadership journey, a lot of times I haven't been in a position of power, more of an influence. And I think that as women, many of us have to navigate that situation, especially, in certain contexts where you may not have a lot of power. You do have influence, but you don't always have a lot of power. And I was thinking, wow, if I started doing that, these are my core values and I'm not going to tolerate X, Y, and Z. I mean, I can't do that with my dad, with his hot temper. I just can't, as much as I'd like to. And there have been times in my life when I actually have kind of ducked out, but it doesn't help the situation always to do that. Sometimes you have the ability to navigate through that and you don't sometimes, but even just thinking about what a conversation like that could look like feels more empowering. It's like, in a way, you're taking power back and you're saying, you know what, I'm going to create some boundaries here. And it's really, it's messy and it's really tricky. And sometimes relationships, you don't have enough there's not enough stable foundation to have those hard discussions yet. And you kind of have to build to it, at least in my situation in my life. I've experienced that in life. And there are sometimes when there are those hard line things where you're going to draw the line in the sand and you say, I'm not going to, this is a violation of my values and I cannot live with it. And I've been the whistleblower, and I've had to do really hard things that have really financially damaged my family because there was such a violation of values that I couldn't sleep at night if I didn't do what I did, kind of a thing. So I know that there's those hardline things, but sometimes when there's relationships involved and not just work relationships, you can't fire your family. You've got, it's tricky. So I don't know. Could you speak to that maybe a little bit?
But Patty, I think you actually just said something really interesting, which is like you almost use your values and your non-negotiables to draw your boundaries, right? Which I didn't really think I would come here tonight and learn a lot, which is really fantastic. But you also said something really interesting, which is you can't fire your family. I guess, I think in some ways it's sad, but maybe in some ways you can, in the sense of like, maybe not permanently, but also just to say like, would it be so bad to say I'm protecting my resilience by doing this? Or because this is such a core value for me, this conversation or this situation is really impacting that. And not to sound fragile or anything, but just, when things are that exhausting, you have to almost ask, is it worth it? Like, we have one life, it's already very tiring, working is tiring. And, I think, are you getting more out of it, or are you putting more into it than you're getting out of it? It sounds very calculating and transactional, but energy is very finite in that sense. Yeah. And then sorry, I know Charlotte, I think you were asking something.
You're fine. Actually, I wanted to acknowledge that there are a couple of things in the chat that I think we can discuss. One, about the repercussions and responses to women of color who stand up for their core values. And yes, that is a different experience that we always have to keep in mind, because we can very much step into the spaces and operate out of this center, these core values, and yet sometimes they clash with dominant culture understanding and engagement. So it comes across or is not valued in the same way as you sitting down with your non-negotiables and saying, this is not how I don't show up the best way in this way, right? I can come back when this is de-escalated and we can talk in a more rational way. And so I don't know that the same response for women of color shows up that way. And I think we always have to be really careful about how we talk about core values and leadership and how they show up culturally. And asking from a different lens, not just about women, but how then do we help women leaders understand those differences so they help navigate that a little bit better.
And do you think both for women and then just for any group, right? Making this more part of the conversation of any company, of any organization is helpful. I feel like the more that I help, for example, just so that it doesn't sound squishy, it doesn't sound weird, it doesn't sound foreign, for example, so that if everybody, how some companies have readmes or whatever about it, so that it becomes just part of the way that you talk about yourself, each other. We almost socialize this as part of an organizational operating system almost, right? That may, I think that's, I think if you, same, almost like if you hear somebody who's not being heard or whose voice is not being heard and you, sponsorship beyond even mentorship, right? But if you're also starting to say, well, I know that one of Charlotta's core values is this, and that might be very, this may not, I'm just thinking of ways to also start making this part of just how we talk.
Yeah, so you're literally talking about a cultural shift. right?
Mhm.
You're not just talking about showing up and having a training or a conversation, but it is shifting the culture. And I think it's possible. I don't know that we'll see those big shifts in our lifetime. I think what's going to happen is, you know, you're gonna lay a foundation that other people are going to be able to build on, but we are fighting on multiple fronts right now. The notion that women should have agency and voice, just in general, right? And so, let alone show up in a boardroom or in a business, setting aside culture for just a second. If you're surrounded by people who are operating out of an old paradigm, it means that we take a little more time in order to socialize this whole idea of leadership value coming from a core space, and that someone else's value should be just as important to you as your own, right? Mm. And so the challenge, as you brought all this up around resiliency, is this whole idea of being exhausted with fighting, even when you stand in your truth and you stand on this whole notion that I've done all these things, right? I've reflected on this, I've repeated this, I've replaced this in my own life, but I am still dealing with an environment that may not be conducive to the way in which I show up authentically as me.
Yep.
Which is hard. And like, I appreciate your work, and, you know, if we could duplicate you and drop you off into all these other places and just do that hard work of coaching people through that, that would be wonderful. I also want to acknowledge that Elena, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, talks about the different personas that she steps into, which is perfectly ethical, but doesn't always match her personality. And again, I think it goes to understanding where you are and the role one must play in the spaces where we are. And I think you can still be authentic to who you are, and yet have to show up very differently, depending on knowing the culture, knowing the atmosphere. So what do you say to that? Because that seems to be a little more hard work in the space of coming to being resilient and not exhausting yourself with the foolishness, but still having to work with structures that we don't control.
Yeah, here's an interesting, I am answering your question. It may sound like I'm answering it obliquely, but one of the things I think is, it's a really useful skill regardless, but I think connecting sort of these two worlds is connecting. Wow, I'm going to use the word connecting like 5 times, but just excuse that. But when you're talking about this, when you're talking about how you lead, when you're talking about your values, also connecting this to the why. So I think my next book should be called So What, because it's one of the most frequent things I say to women. Like, if somebody walks up to me and says, I lead with empathy, okay, great. So what? Not that it's not important, but if we can always make sure we're grounding everything we talk about in the outcomes it creates, because that's also important, right? I mean, so if we can also say, hey, one of my values is transparency, one of my values is curiosity, whatever, great. If we can also say, and it's important to me because I will be able to have a team who feels safe. And when they feel safe to experiment. And experimentation is really important in this kind of company, because then they're all going to be doing X, Y, Z. So if we can always connect it to the outcomes, then I think people also don't feel like it's squishy. They don't feel uncomfortable with it. And you're also speaking with, it's a way to also accelerate your own career and things like that, if you can always connect it with the so what. So, you know, in a software company, curiosity, transparency, it's important, right? You're telling customers when they can expect things. You cannot make a software company successful unless you're experimenting. So I think you're also making yourself sound very strategic. And so always speaking in the so what and the outcomes will also elevate you as a thinker, a thought leader, a strategist, and maybe unsoften some of this, because sometimes people get threatened by softness. That's a thought. Crystal.
Oh my God, you are like preaching. So can we talk about this? Can we talk about strategy and outcomes? I'm actually working on some research right now that's exploring this a little bit more deeply. And when you're thinking about outcomes, it sounds so cliche to talk about strategy, to be a strategic thinker and strategic change and strategic. But unless and until you get down into the tactics of that, you don't achieve outcomes. And so when are we going to stop talking about strategy and start talking about tactics?
Okay, can I give you an example?
Please,
Okay,
please.
so there's some good examples too. I'm not doing this as a shameless plug, but like in my book, I actually talk about this because I hate the word strategic. Because if I read one more resume that says strategic leader passionate about success, I will vomit on myself.
You and me both.
What does that mean, right? No shit. Can I say shit? Okay.
I adore you.
You have to, like, if you're not passionate about success, why are you here? But I want to
Mhm.
give you an example. So I think so many of us focus on the what and the how that we do, but
Right.
we don't then tie it to the so what. So I'm going to speak in like a tech world because that's the world that I spend a lot of time in. But so many times I will have somebody come to me and say, I'm a customer success person. So here's what I do. I create customer programs, blah, 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 blah. So what?
Mm-hmm.
What I want you to do is flip the script and tell me I'm a chief customer officer who creates recurring revenue and expands market share for this kind of company. I didn't say anything about strategy.
Mm-hmm.
What I said is like, what in a boardroom are people going to get really excited and start doing, like, I call it my shoulder dance. Like that's going to get me excited.
Yes.
And the how is kind of incidental, but you can tell me one fragment about the how, which is by optimizing the customer experience. So again, I want to know the so what. And I always think of it like some of you might have toddlers or toddlers where it's like, why, until you get so sick of them that you want to sell them, or you just say, because I said so. And when you reach the because I said so, that's when you're at the so what, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the value creation, it's the whatever. And when you've reached that point, now I have finished asking you the so what questions and we're there. It's the same with like digital transformation. I create strategies for digital transformation. Oh, good God. So what? Like,
Mm-hmm.
what is it doing? I'm making the enterprise, I'm creating more efficient, lots of things. And I happen to be doing it by creating digital transformation strategies. That's the only time I want to hear strategy. So I want to lead with the so what, a little tiny bit of what and how, tiny. And that's how, again, we're speaking about ourselves strategically. And here's what I love. I love starting a sentence with this. I'm known for. Isn't that nice and powerful?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we as women, why don't we do that? I'm known for. It takes a little swagger, but it's nice.
I think you're absolutely right, because recently I've been starting conversations with, I'm known as the Olivia Pope of change management. And people like, and it perks people up and they listen. I think you're onto something.
And Crystal, can I challenge you with something? Can you tell me why change management is important?
Where is change management important, or why?
Why?
Well, particularly in the technology space, we technologists do a lot of innovation and creating new things. And that's great unless they're not used. So
Mm-hmm.
change management is important to turning flipping it makes a difference between flipping a switch and actually having something utilized by the people for which we built it for. I'll give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
So I do work a lot in technology, and for the last couple of years, I've been working with digital transformations. and particularly Microsoft 365 tools and technologies. And you have the technology teams that are implementing these different platforms, and they say we've achieved adoption, which we have. It's in our environment. This is what we're using. We've turned off Lotus Notes and we have Microsoft Outlook. But when you take a look at the people adoption, the utilization of those tools, sometimes they can be less than 10% utilization. So change management, specifically organizational change management, not to be confused with change control, has to do with increasing utilization.
But in a way, I could be totally wrong, but I think that change management is the how. It's like you make sure that you help you. It's like the ROI. You make sure that companies actually secure the right ROI on these big initiatives by bringing the people and the projects along, something like that. Does that make sense?
100%, yes.
So I'm wondering if that's the actual highest value of you. You are the Olivia who?
Hope.
Sorry.
You know the TV show Scandal?
Is this terrible that I don't watch TV?
It's not terrible because I'm a whole doctoral student, nor do I.
Okay. But I'm wondering if like ROI is really important, because that's what ultimately, that's the bottom line, right? So like if you were to come to me and say, because I say to a lot of people who are in the mergers and acquisitions world, if you can say that you secure the ROI of an acquisition, now I want to talk to you, right? So if you can make sure that these big multi-million-dollar projects, you are securing the ROI on them through change management. Just a thought, and maybe we can.
I like it. I like it a lot. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm. And I know we're kind of over time, but I would love to come and speak to any of your companies, or just you're like such an amazing group of people with the thought. You have made my brain flex. It's very late in the day for my brain to be flexing.
Tissa, it's a great conversation. I don't have words to express how excited I am to have you here, to have this conversation. And our audience, they are amazing, with a lot of great questions, collaboration. That was really exciting. So I want to thank you in the name of the center for your time here with us, and leave the invitation anytime that you want to speak to us. Please feel welcome to Pepperdine, to the center. We will be glad to have you here. Anything else that you want to share before we close this session?
I just really, this was so delightful. I really appreciate it. Just connect with me on LinkedIn, and I would really appreciate all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Beautiful.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for attending today. And with that, we conclude our session.